Today I have with me Vishaan Chakrabarti. Vishaan is the incoming dean of the UC Berkeley College of Environmental Design. He's a founding partner at the Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, and he's a longtime city planning designer type in New York. He's been involved in projects from Sunnyside Yards in Queens to Domino Sugar Factory in Brooklyn, and many other major public-private partnerships and all. But today, we're going to focus our conversation on this radical, and I don't use that word lightly, radical proposal to redesign, reimagine Manhattan, which is the most expensive landmass, most valuable landmass in the world. Imagine Manhattan without cars. So we're going to talk about the real estate implications of that and a lot more. There's incremental small changes that people have tried, right? They've tried to imagine a more pedestrian-friendly New York, a more mindful New York, a New York that tries to take into account equity across, sort of racial classes, socioeconomic classes. You're going for an entire sort of flip of that model and saying, let's start from scratch. So did you do that in your spare time?
Yeah, I think that the New York Times pays its op-ed contributors like $150, so we might get a $150 check to buy a couple of margaritas for my staff when we get back. But no, we do the occasional project where we don't have a client, where it's a social advocacy project for us. And I think one of the things, when you say it's radical, so if you look at our presentation, or you can see it on our website, look at the Park Avenue image.
I did see that.
The Park Avenue image, all we're calling for on Park Avenue is going back to the original design for Park Avenue, right? That Cornelius Vanderbilt put forward, right? Which had a park in the middle. And there was, just over time, especially in the 50s, when we were in the post-war boom era for cars, we took away the park and turned it into this useless median, right? And so all we're proposing radically is to go back to the original design, which I would remind everyone is what created one of the most valuable areas for real estate in the world. I think we have to remind ourselves of kind of even the genesis of the value of New York.
Right.
And the genesis of the value of New York was not about cars interacting with other cars. It was about people interacting with people, right? It's that, Rem Koolhaas wrote about the culture of congestion. That is the sort of the magic sauce of New York City. Now, of course, everyone's going to say, well, congestion, COVID,
we're gonna talk about that a bit,
right? But even in a COVID environment, the idea walking and biking in our city has proven to be actually a great response to COVID, right? As long as you've got the ample sidewalk space, bike space, and so forth. And that's where, again, you want to eliminate the private car, right? So that you have more room for these other uses.
Right. I guess the lens that you took, right? Most real estate development and architects who work for real estate developers, it's about additive and about getting creative, right? How can I add a little more, land to, how can I add a little more square footage to my area? How can I build a little higher, build a little taller, build a little denser? Whereas you went and just re-examined the whole thing and said, look, what was it? I think 4 times the area of Central Park has been taken by cars, right? So you said, instead of trying all this jujitsu with the buildings, if you just expand the landmass, which is not something, they keep saying land, they don't build any more of it, right? That's the old chestnut. But there's plenty to go around, I guess, in your plan. Have you thought a little bit about what that would do to land values? Because your plan, your vision is going to collide with the realities of politics in New York City, right? So that's what I'm really trying to understand is, if you're expanding the supply in a way, you're going to dramatically impact value.
Well, look, 30% of Manhattan is roadbed, right? And so we need to think about how to more effectively use that. The CEOs of real estate companies are going to say, oh my gosh, all of those tenants that drive their private cars in from New Jersey or Westchester who are senior managers, they're going to, this is going to be another hit to my bottom line in a world where COVID is already representing like a kind of existential threat to the New York office market because of remote work and so forth.
Yeah.
I think they need to think about it exactly the opposite way, because if you think about the CEO of a major company who's making the decision to locate his or her office space in an office building, the first thing they think about is, how are my employees going to get here? Location, location, location. That's the other chestnut, right? And so what you need to think about isn't just that senior manager driving in from Westchester. You need to think about the entire workforce that's coming to these buildings. And is their life made better or worse by our proposal? And you can absolutely, one of the things that is at the end of that Times article, and I hope didn't get buried, was we tried to say that this proposal wasn't just about Manhattan, but the fact that when you reduce private cars or eliminate private cars in Manhattan, what you do is eliminate the demand of all of that traffic regionally. So think about, for example, your average middle manager who lives in Montclair, New Jersey, or Staten Island, and takes an express bus into New York City every day. Their commute times drop by almost half, right, when you do this. So the thing is, for the regional workforce, it makes New York City way more attractive. And so, you know what rich people need to start doing is start thinking about people other than just other rich people.
That would be nice, Vishaan, but
that's the problem.
Right.
That's the problem. They just think through the lens of their own bubble, of their own black car, and they don't think about, when you've got Twitter saying that the whole workforce can work remotely forever. The people who've been doing this in places like New York City, who think that they can just apply the same old formula again and again and again and think that in a post-COVID environment that's going to work, they have to wake up and they have to understand that young people want a different lifestyle. People are tired of places like Penn Station. They're tired of the fact that our city is just, all of these things we call transit-oriented development are relying on transit that was built 100 years ago by our predecessors. They have to stop doing that, stop thinking about it just through the lens of their own kind of country club set, and think about it through the lens of the worker.
And
I think wants a better commute.
I think the point is that once the spell has been broken by this prolonged working from home, it's going to be a lot harder, no matter what they do, to bring people back to the office. So is there any sort of accommodation for this new reality that we're seeing with these hulking office complexes that probably are not going to see full occupancy for years to come, or need to be repositioned or reimagined in some way?
So, I worked for the Bloomberg administration after 9/11, and we upzoned a lot of Manhattan, including Hudson Yards, the area around the High Line. I was very much in favor, it happened years later, of the East Midtown rezoning and One Vanderbilt and all of that stuff. It's terrific, and we need that new office space. And I think that the newer office space that has newer ventilation systems,
has a better shot,
that has outdoor terraces and so forth, that stuff should do pretty well in the rebound. What you have to worry about is the stuff in the middle.
That garment district building in Midtown South with like HVAC from the 1800s or something.
Yeah, although the ones with operable windows, again, are going to be in better shape. I worry about stuff like the stuff like along 6th Avenue, and in some cases, we're going to have a huge housing crisis that stems not from gentrification, but from homelessness and from poverty. And, in some cases, I'm hoping we're going to see the conversion of older office stock into residential where that's possible. So say a vaccine comes out next month, right? The genie you can't put in a bottle, back in the bottle, is this remote work thing.
Right.
And sure. So for my office, like my office is staying in New York City, we're all going to run back to the office as soon as it's safe, right? Because we want to interact with each other. We're in a creative industry. We want to be together. You also have to understand that a huge amount of New York's workforce, the paralegal, the person who's filling out insurance forms, a lot of those folks work in a cubicle, don't need to interact with their colleagues as much as other industries do. They live, those folks they commute through horrible places like Penn Station, right? They have really dreadful commutes. That person's going to go to their CEO and they're going to say, look, here's the deal I'll make with you. I want to work from home.
Uh-huh.
I'll stay in the region
Uh-huh.
and commute in once every 2 weeks for a meeting or an event or
So,
something.
so here's where I don't even think they'll need to have that conversation. I think the economics of it for the occupier will make that happen. So
Right.
we're not in disagreement about that. What I'd like to understand, and your whole plan, and the reason that I'm so drawn to it is that it says stop bubbling yourself or bubblifying yourself, right? Understand that this is a city. Understand that there are needs that go beyond your needs as a as a CEO. It's a much more equitable plan, or at least it hopes to be. But in a post-COVID world, do you not feel like the psychology is going to be even more stratification, even more bubbling?
Well, I hope not. The answer can't be, though, that 8.6 million New Yorkers, 3.5 million people who come in and out of Manhattan every day, are going to somehow drive in their own car because they don't want to be on public transit because they don't want to risk it, right? And so, how do you then address this problem? Like, if that is the psychology,
Mhm.
what we're trying to say is let's use the space. So, for example, in our plan, you can run way more buses. So, like, I don't know about you, I was never a bus rider because
Mhm.
buses are always so slow in New York City. And then 14th Street happened. And I live and work near 14th Street. And when 14th Street happened, I was like, holy shit, I can get across 14th Street in 6 minutes on a bus.
One of the things that has always been, there's been a conundrum, right? Hey, the land is too expensive for me to build anything but luxury condos, right? That was the case in 14, 15, 16 in many parts of Manhattan. And there was this whole sort of unfortunate situation where housing was built for people who needed it least. The kind of buildings that were built were essentially not serving, not really solving the affordable housing issue, not really creating a more equitable Manhattan, right? That was part of the equation. And the reason is land prices kept going up. Banks would only finance something if you could sell condos at 1,200, 1,400 square foot, et cetera. You're talking about, I think, as we said, 4 into 846 acres more of land, right? With this plan, what sort of housing do you hope would be built
Well,
given this
when I
free?
ran the real estate program at Columbia,
Yep.
my first question to the incoming class
Mm.
would be walk around New York City. Why is there surface parking in Manhattan? Like, why is there a single surface parking lot in one of the most valuable pieces of land mass in the world? Right? Well, if you're in real estate, you know the answer, which is someone's got a low basis on that land, and the NOI they get from parking is risk-free, right? And they have therefore the incentive to keep it parked as opposed to building
Yep.
is, and the tax basis is really low. So what am I doing? I'm taking away their market,
Yeah.
right? By taking away the private car. So now all of a sudden that landowner has an outsized incentive, right, to redevelop that property. Now, I'm really hoping that under a President Biden, we're going to see a national housing agenda where the federal government gets involved as they have historically
Right.
since the 1930s
Mhm.
in the housing market and creates new incentives to create housing. I don't think people realize the world of hurt out there.
Right.
And the world of hurt that's only going to expand. I mean, I've lived through 9/11, 2008. Real estate's a lagging indicator. I mean, everything that happens in real estate tends to happen 1 to 3 years after the national economic
Right,
crisis.
and we're seeing some rumblings now, but the real pain is already being felt at street level, right?
Right. And my point is just we're going to have a massive, massive homeless and poverty crisis in this country, right? That is going to remind us of the 1930s. And we're going to need a government response that's commensurate with the 1930s. We're going to need that level of intervention coupled with the fact that all of a sudden you're going to have this land. So that formula that I know very well that you're saying where a
Right,
developer says
and
I can
you
only
were a
build luxury
private.
condos.
I'm trying to understand how their thinking goes from, all right, let's build the least housing we can for the wealthiest people and replicate that formula over and over again, because
Because there
that's the
won't be the
part.
market. There won't be the market for the luxury condos. Who's going to buy
Mhm.
them, right? I mean, we had a glut of luxury condos in New York City pre-COVID,
Mhm.
right? So who's going to buy them? What did the how deep does the real estate industry think the market is for $6 million apartments? I
Okay,
mean, we got to get real about this stuff
right.
and start, you know, this entire discipline has to focus on the needs of actual everyday people,
Hmm.
right? And look, I don't, when I say that, I understand developers, often when they're looking at a pro forma, nothing works, like you said,
Right.
except because the underlying land cost is so high. So one of the things that, like I said, our proposal would do would create much more available land because it's
Hmm.
not available for surface parking, right? And so that's going to bring down land prices.
Hmm.
We also have to change our tax regime because there's too much of an incentive for people to land bank
Right.
right now, right? The government has to think incredibly broadly. I'm not trying to put this all on developers. The government has to think incredibly, I mean, obviously, NIMBYism, it has to be this pre-COVID thing that died with COVID,
Hmm.
right? But like the government has to step in and do a bunch of things in terms of taxes, in terms of regulatory reform,
And when you're
to
talking
loosen up
government,
housing,
you're talking about
every
every
level,
layer of government.
every
Okay.
level of government. I'm talking at the federal level, there needs to be investment at the state and city level in terms of regulation, in terms of just creating new programs
Hmm.
because our cities, cities have survived pandemics, cities have survived terrorist attacks. But remember, like after 9/11, New York City received $20 billion of government aid,
Yeah.
right? I mean, we're not going to just recover on our own, right? This is a huge crisis for cities.
Well, you put this plan out there. You had been probably finalizing it as we were in full shutdown, and people could really sort of viscerally grasp the benefits of this carless or private carless Manhattan, right? There was so many anecdotal things about, oh, I biked across the city today, and what a joy, and couldn't it always be this way, etc. Unfortunately, that seems like a bit of a distant memory right now. Traffic's back. I'm in LA at the moment. I drove out yesterday. It looked like, sort of freeway from hell as usual. So do you think we've already missed our shot in getting these sort of things? There is a momentum that builds with certain things. And when you can visualize it, you can say, all right, look, we can make this a long-term situation. In New York, in many cases, we're back to where we were.
Yeah, no, look, that's a great question. That's why we did the article as a provocation. I am very much hoping that this becomes a topic in the mayoral election. It should be a topic in the next gubernatorial debate. And it needs to be thought about broadly. And I think what's interesting is this came out a week before I was moving to
Yeah.
California, and all sorts of people have contacted me about whether this is going to be possible in San Francisco.
Did you get
Right?
any industry reaction? I'm curious if, a lot of your old clients or anyone, did you hear from the industry at all about this?
Crickets. And I'm surprised because I heard from community activists. There were some people who were
Because you knew
concerned.
this blew up. There's no way that they did not see this. There's no way that Rebney or
Oh,
developers, there's just no
absolutely,
way. Right.
absolutely. But again, look, a lot of there's folks in there that I've worked with. I have a ton of respect for. Building in New York is hard. I'm not a development basher by any stretch of the imagination, but at the same time, I really think that people have to look beyond their windshield.
Hmm.
They're just really what I find in the New York development community. Not everyone, but too many people are just too focused in their own reality, right? As opposed to, like I said, think about the fact that real estate in New York as an industry is
Hmm.
serving a city of 8.6 million people, and the vast majority of them don't own cars. There's only about 1 million car owners in New York City, right? Most of these people move around on mass transit. It's part of why they move to New York City. So they've
Hmm.
got to think about their market,
And you know
not
what's
about
funny is
their friends.
you say that, and in their minds, their perception has always been, I'm a developer slash civic champion of New York. Great, that's the way a lot of big developers think about themselves as well. They
Sure,
think about
absolutely.
themselves as Mr. New York, quote unquote, right? And
And look,
and there's some disconnect there because
no,
you
look, and
still see.
there's really a tradition of that. If you think about the Rudin family,
Right.
obviously,
Uh-huh.
right, and the
Mhm.
recovery after the 1970s, that's absolutely been true. But they also look. a whole bunch of
Well, I
us.
think, Vishaan, just to push back on that, in the 1970s, during the fiscal crisis, they prepaid their property taxes, right? That's one of the big sort of things that people always bring up. This time, we didn't really see much in terms of stepping up as an industry collectively and offering some. We didn't see that much of that. Yeah.
Look, part of what's happened in the industry, again, as a participant in the 9/11 recovery, is, right after 9/11, people thought, oh my God, no one will even build a Quonset hut in New York City again. And what we did, government is always, it's very, government policy is an axe, not a scalpel. Like it doesn't work in very precise ways, things like zoning,
Mhm.
right, and tax policy. And so we loosened up all the spigots, we upzoned, all sorts of incentives were created for development. At the same time, quantitative easing was going on at the federal level. And by 2005, you had this huge rush into condo development in a city that largely only built rentals, right? Up until the 2000. And so this thing about gentrification in the real estate industry, a lot of that was inadvertent. It's just very hard once you loosen the reins to constrain it again, right? And so all of a sudden we had this city that not just recovered, but
Mhm.
became this ultra, ultra wealthy city. And then all of a sudden you saw in Manhattan from 2000 and 2010, the number of children under the age of 5 go up by 40%,
Mhm.
which
Mhm.
meant that all the people who used to suburbanize were suddenly buying 5-bedroom condominiums in Manhattan. And so the
Mhm.
entire gestalt of the city changes, right? And the point
Right.
is just the whole industry changed because of those dynamics. And now we've got another crisis that is asking us to change again and not just try to go back to the model that has existed since 9/11, but actually say, no, this next model has to be about affordability, and it has to be about equity, and it has to take into all of these things into account. And I think we should start with our streets.